Okay, so thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm sure everybody knows my kind of topic, having kind of presented it over the last 3 years at various different stages of its kind of development. So my project, I'm a literary scholar in 20th century modernist literature. I did my PhD on the Russian American novelist Vladimir Nabokov. And the book which resulted, my first monograph from my PhD research, was called Vladimir Nabokov and the Ideological Aesthetic. It kind of came from my idea that Nabokov is a writer who professed publicly to be only interested in the aesthetic dimension of art, of its relation to the world, etc., and to be completely uninterested in politics or political engagement, littérature engagée, as the French would call it, the most famous proponent of which was perhaps Jean-Paul Sartre, and many others in the Anglophone sphere as well. So Nabokov's opposition to political engagement within art is a kind of curious thing to behold, given that he was a Russian aristocrat who lost his titles, his fortune, and everything in the Russian Revolution of 1917. And he was, for much of his life, after he emigrated to Germany and then to America, where he made a career for himself and became an incredibly famous novelist, inherently and very vociferously at times, and private mostly, an anti-communist. So my notion was, is there an aesthetic dimension in Nabokov's literary work, his literary aesthetics, which express his very peculiar political outlook? In another way of saying, is the writing itself expressive of a political or ideological position? So this was what I sought to explore in my PhD research and in the Nabokov book. And this notion of the ideological aesthetic was born. And what I kind of discovered within my kind of book, and it was published in 2017, was that there is a very distinct and very kind of subjective ideological aesthetic within Nabokov's work. And he felt the need to say that he was not interested in politics. He didn't engage publicly in the political because he felt that his literary aesthetics, his writing, expressed everything he needed to say about politics. So it was this idea, which I kind of developed further in my kind of second book before I came to WIAS at the University of Constance, the Zukunftskolleg. I took this notion of the ideological aesthetic and I applied it to a more kind of explicitly political context. Now, this is the problematic of modernist fascist writers who were part of the avant-garde, part of the kind of artistic kind of vanguard, the kind of modernist kind of vanguard within their respective countries, who after the First World War, through experience of that war, turned to fascist politics. It's a problematic which isn't really directly addressed in much of modernist studies because of its variously kind of uncomfortable sort of nature. So I looked at various writers, English, French, German, Italian, examples, Wyndham Lewis in England, in France, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, Pierre-Jules Larochelle, Henri de Montalon, in Germany, Ernst Junger, and Gottfried Benn, for example, and in Italy, the Italian futurist painter and polemicist, Marinetti, and also the kind of esoteric fascist writer, Julius Evola. What I find that there is a profound ideological aesthetic within the works of these writers as well. Now, this is obviously quite an unsurprising kind of development to some extent, but what I discovered was that the ideological aesthetic is expressive of something which doesn't need to take an explicitly political character in a kind of sociological, historical sense, but can be determined from the aesthetic makeup of the text itself, from the literary aesthetics, from the kind of the sort of sentiment of it to some extent. Now, this is the idea which I brought to WIAS, and this notion of the ideological aesthetic I'm interested in the parallels which this period, the modernist period, the early 20th century period, has to the current period, where we're experiencing a kind of a recrudescence to some extent, a resurgence of extremism, polarization, technological alienation, and various other kind of parallels which kind of testify to this sort of almost Nietzschean recurrence of historical circumstance, perhaps not in exactly the same way, but in a very similar way. So my idea with this project, the ideological aesthetic, was to kind of determine a theory of the ideological aesthetic as it relates to contemporary art, contemporary literature, and specifically to the internet, and the way that aesthetic subjectivity is determines political activity online in real life, and within our kind of interrelations with each other. So I started with some kind of assumptions that this ideological aesthetic, this is based on my kind of previous work. It's still very much a kind of speculative notion which concerns a very kind of fundamental phenomenological concern, I suppose. Let me just minimize this because I can't see my own notes here. So this phenomenological notion related to the very notion of perception and consciousness and the way that individuals perceive their material conditions. So the ideological aesthetic is this kind of synthesis, this kind of like a syncretic kind of concept, a material and bodily consciousness which is equal to aesthetic perception. Now, aesthetic perception, we go back to the kind of very original etymological notion of the aesthetic, which is the Greek aesthetikos, which was itself a synonym for perception. So when we talk about aesthetic perception, we talk about how this notion of the aesthetic, which was kind of rarefied within the kind of Enlightenment discourse, within the Kantian discourse, has returned in the contemporary moment to this idea once more of perception. And this idea of aesthetic perception, aesthesis, aesthetikos, which is itself equivalent and interchangeable with ideology. So various starting points, Louis Althusser is one of the most kind of famous theorists of ideology, and his kind of letter on art, a very kind of enigmatic work, but ultimately one which kind of differs and leaves unresolved the kind of questions of ideology's relations to art. And what I have done over the last 3 years is kind of developed in collaboration with various people, bring these kind of three facets together into a kind of synthesis of a rigorous kind of definition of the theory of the ideological aesthetic. The primary output of this is the article, which will be out next month in September. Is it August yet? No, in September in the journal Angelaki, the Journal of Theoretical Humanities, titled The Ideological Aesthetic, the Political as Inevitable and Epiphenomenal. And what I'll do for the rest of the talk is just to give a brief kind of outline of what this essay is, why I think it's quite significant. I mean, Angelaki, I think, I mean, many of you in the kind of natural sciences perhaps not familiar with it, but it's a very kind of a solid journal, I think, that publishes various kind of speculative continental philosophy subjects, and I'm very, very happy to have published, or will have published, in this journal. So just to kind of give a kind of outline of this paper. In this paper, we outline a theory that kind of explicates what we describe as the hypertrophy of the political in relation to contemporary art, to literature, and culture in general. Now, what do we mean by hypertrophy? It is the sense that the political is everywhere, but nowhere, in the sense that everybody seems to think that they have an engagement and a relation to the political, particularly in the online sphere, yet their political gestures, their political positions, their political actions to some extent, or activism, is fundamentally inefficacious. It doesn't seem to have any palpable effect on the political status quo. So we begin with a kind of an engagement with a very interesting work that came out in 2016, by the French art curator and art theorist Nicolas Bourriaud. And this is called the X Form in 2016. Now, this is a very curious work in the sense that it seems to have passed completely under the radar, which is quite curious when we consider who Nicolas Bourriaud is. Nicolas Bourriaud was the author of one of the most influential works of contemporary art theory, perhaps in the last 30 years, which was Esthétique relationnelle, which is relational aesthetics. Relational aesthetics is not a work that many people in general will be familiar with, but they will be familiar undoubtedly with its kind of main premises and, of course, of its effects. If one goes to an art gallery anywhere in the world these days, within the last 20 years, they would have encountered various art exhibitions which demand your kind of participation as an audience member, which engages the audience member to be part of the spectacle, to be part of the art project, to be engaged in a kind of relational way within the art practice. Now, this idea of relational aesthetics, which Bourriaud posited in his book in 1997, was the most influential in informing contemporary art for the last 20 years. Now, what's significant about the X Form in 2016 is the ideas which Bourriaud presented in 1997 are almost completely recanted in 2016, when he states that we have to return instead to some form of materialist critique, which he to some extent already disavowed in 1997. So Nicolas Bourriaud, the real of globalism, haunted by the spectre of what is unproductive, I can't actually see what this says because this timer is in the way. so I might just block that a little bit. Okay, so we'll just redefinition of the repressed and unwanted as potential revolutionary subject trickles down in contemporary art, which is the working definition of the X-formal, the site where border negotiations unfold between what is rejected and what is admitted, products and waste. So this idea that the world is now not entirely populated by things which have value, but instead products which have waste. And we have a kind of increase in kind of digital landfill, and also a kind of an environment, for example, which is filled with things and overfilled with things. So his idea is to kind of take these and make these, instead of a kind of relational relationship to the audience, we use this kind of idea of the remainder as the kind of next materialist avenue of art. So we're not so much interested in this, instead in Bourriaud's other kind of hypothesis, which kind of states that what was wrong with the kind of previous theory of arts is one which kind of problematizes this idea of agency, action, history, and simply takes this recourse to denouncing mechanisms of authority and repression without actually forming any form of kind of substantive materialist critique. So his kind of critique of the art, which he has his own kind of work had a very large influence in kind of informing, is that art has now become the space where politics is deployed and where it becomes a match of display value, pure and simple. So art, which usually is where the very site where ideology is laid bare, has become the space where politics is deployed. And it has become display value, pure and simple. So our idea of the ideological aesthetics takes this notion of contemporary art. We also find it in contemporary literature, this idea of the kind of very superficial political critique. And we take this notion of how this idea of our engagement with the political simultaneously politicizes yet depoliticizes our political perspective, which is a difficult kind of premise to follow, but if you bear with me for a second, I'll try to explain. So we went back to the very controversial German Nazi philosopher and jurist Carl Schmitt and his concept of the political, And he describes this kind of emergence of the liberal state. He was speaking very specifically of Weimar Germany. And the state, the basic premise of the Politico for Schmidt is the idea of the friend and enemy distinction. That an enemy must exist for a state to have a kind of sense of political legitimacy. But what liberal democracy in Schmidt's time did was to kind of remove the political character of the state in such a way that therefore everything is at least potentially political, but it's no longer possible to assert a very specifically political characteristic onto our kind of relations. So with this, we took on a kind of very kind of detailed reading of Louis Althusser through his kind of reappraisal by the philosopher Warren Montag in 2013. And we attempted to kind of reinstate an idea of Althusser's theory of ideology, which is to a very large extent still the most influential, but one discarded to some extent and kind of misread intentionally or not. And we went back to the kind of letter of Althusser's theory via Montag to kind of re-examine how this theory of ideology relates to the contemporary situation and our theory of the ideological aesthetic. And some of the most kind of pertinent observations which Montag himself has is that ideology is not only, so an interesting quote here to kind of reproduce, men live their actions commonly related by the classical tradition to freedom and to consciousness in ideology, through and by ideology. In short, the lived relation of men to the world, including history and political action or in an action, passes through ideology, or better is ideology itself. Now, this is a very kind of interesting notion and one that is kind of glossed over often in our kind of over-readiness to focus on the more kind of famous of Althusser's philosophical outputs, is that he thought of ideology as, in essence, a form of perceptual phenomenon. The lived relation of an individual to the world in political action or inaction passes through ideology, or better is ideology itself. So this kind of, we argue, lays the kind of way for this notion of ideology as essentially a perceptual phenomena equivalent to and almost interchangeable with the aesthetic as it is now, not perhaps in the Kantian sense, but in the sense of its original etymological origins. And then we kind of use some kind of insights in contemporary phenomenology, for example, to argue, which also kind of argues this notion that phenomenology, this idea, which is to a very large extent the philosophy of perception, is essentially, aesthetics is essentially phenomenology, and it is also in a very real sense kind of material, thing-like. So this is a kind of a couple of interesting quotes in that particular vein. Art is no arbitrary theme of phenomenological description. Rather, an artwork is essentially phenomenal. It is an appearance that is not to be taken as the appearance of something, but instead purely as appearance. Accordingly, aesthetics essentially is phenomenology. Aesthetics also at the same time alters phenomenology, insofar as phenomena capable of being experienced aesthetically are not pure correlates of consciousness, but rather things. Artworks are thing-like. It is only for this reason that perception is essentially connected to the experience of them. So this idea of the aesthetic as a kind of, as a phenomenology and as a thing, as ideology, as a kind of both a material and a phenomenological, in a sense, idealist category. And this is the kind of very speculative kind of insights we kind of muster in our theory of the ideological aesthetic as we present it in this paper. So what we kind of come to the conclusion, and it is a very long paper, and this is obviously going to be, it's over, I think it's about 10,000, just over 10,000 words. So any kind of summary of this may seem to some extent a little bit too rushed, so I'm perfectly willing to answer questions. So what we have is this form of subjective perception. This is the theory of the ideological aesthetic that Althusser maintains lies at the center of every ideological, i.e., imaginary representation of the real world. It is this relation that contains the cause which has to explain the imaginary distortion of the ideological representation of the real world. Now, what does this mean? Again, it's this idea, and this is something which nobody else has heretofore kind of properly made the connection, I don't believe, is that we understand, so this idea of ideology as equivalent to aesthetic perception, which Althusser implicitly kind of posits. So this is from an unpublished Althusser extract, which Montag comments on. We understand that ideological representation imparts a certain representation of reality that makes allusion to the real in a certain way, but at the same time it bestows only an illusion on reality. We also understand that ideology gives men a certain knowledge, connaissance of their world, or rather allows them to recognize themselves in their world, gives them a certain recognition, but at the same time, ideology only introduces them to its misrecognition, méconnaissance. Allusion, illusion, or recognition, misrecognition, such as ideology from the perspective of its relation to the real. Now, this seems an extremely kind of dense kind of description, but let's attempt to kind of unpack it as we do in this paper. There's three terms here, which are, we believe, vital. Connaissance, méconnaissance, two terms, sorry. These terms we identify, and many others have not really sought to, as coming quite clearly from the kind of psychopathology given by Jacques Lacan in his essential causality of madness. So, and this is the kind of interesting and pertinent quote, which we kind of, sorry, this is very annoying. I think I can't see the rest of the text here. Bear with me a second. Apologies. Stuck in edit mode. Okay, bear with me a second. Let me just, there's a kind of important text to read, so I'll just try to get it. I mean, in the end, I think this quote is very kind of pertinent because it gives us a very good summation of this pathological relationship that we have developed in this emergence of the ideological aesthetic. This is Lacan speaking essentially on the causes of madness, which, as you see, are related to these terms which Althusser describes: ideology, aestheticization of politics, how the aesthetic has become political, how politics has become aesthetic. Now, in the revolt through which the madman seeks to impose the law of his heart onto what seems to him to be the havoc, disorder of the world, it is an insane enterprise in that the subject does not recognize in this havoc the very manifestation of his actual being, of that what he experiences as a law of his heart is but the inverted and virtual image of that same being. He thus doubly misrecognizes it, precisely so as to split its actuality from its virtuality. Now he can escape his actuality only via this virtuality. His being is thus caught in a circle unless he breaks it through some form of violence by which, in lashing out at what he takes to be the havoc, he ends up harming himself because of the social repercussions of his actions. So I think I am a little bit over time now, so I think I will basically just sign off there, and perhaps in the question and answer session I could address some of the potential gaps that I have left unsaid, but this essentially is the end. Thank you.